All right, so for the sake of time here, I will get started with the introductions, and then we're gonna get started. So we have very strong faculty and moderators today. I'll start with introducing our moderators, who in turn will introduce our faculty. We'll moderate this session today, Dr. Irina Duff, who received her medical degree from Moscow State Medical University and her PhD from George August University in Germany. She is currently a fellow at the Department of Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, and she received the prestigious Ross Kirschstein National Research Service Award, and she's a peer reviewer for a Journal of Neuromodulation, very active member of our education committee and journal club and webinar subcommittee. And then I'd like to also introduce my friend, Dr. Nick Nizivic, who's a vice chairman for research and education at the Department of Anesthesiology and Pain Management at Advocate Illinois Masonic Medical Center. He is also a clinical professor of the anesthesiology and surgery at the College of Medicine, University of Illinois at Chicago. He is a current president of the Illinois Society of Interventional Pain Physicians, and he is serving as director at large at the NANS board of directors. So Dr. Nizivic has a strong experience in research. He published more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific articles and was cited more than 4,700 times. One of his recent publications was published at Lancet, which had an impact factor of 202.7, great achievement. And again, my name is Dr. Al Abdesaid. I'm the chair of the education committee. And thank you all for attending today. We will have a very nice discussion about the published Cochrane review. It's one of the series of journal clubs that we started to start analyzing articles that provided I would say suboptimal analysis of spinal cord stimulation efficacy. So it will be a great discussion. And we have Dr. North, Dr. Kiran Patel, Dr. Jason Rosenberg, Dr. Falowski had a conflict. He may or may not make it, but we will continue with our faculty and we'll have a nice discussion again. Thank you for being here. And I will hand it from here to my colleagues, Dr. Irina Duff and Dr. Nick Nizivic.
Hi, just a few things for the webinar. If you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A box. The audience will be kept on mute during the webinar. Questions will be answered once the moderators and panelists have finished their discussion as time allows. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NANS YouTube channel within 48 hours.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you, Dr. Abdesaid, for introducing us. So it's my privilege and honor to introduce our panelists. Dr. Kiran Patel. Dr. Patel is an interventional pain management physician, board certified in pain medicine and anesthesiology. Dr. Patel practicing at the Spine Pain Institute of New York and is also the director of neurosurgical pain at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City. Dr. Patel oversees the neuromodulation program at Lenox Hill Hospital as well as an inpatient pain service. Dr. Patel is an assistant clinical professor in the Hofstra Northwell School of Medicine, as well as the program director for Hofstra Northwell Pain Medicine Fellowship. Dr. Patel participated in clinical neuromodulation research with the goal of improving clinical practice and outcome. She has published extensively in the leading scientific journals and presented her work at the premier scientific meetings. Dr. Patel is an active member of North American Neuromodulation Society Board of Directors. She is currently president of NANS WIN section and co-chair for the NANS cadaver courses. Dr. Patel, thank you for joining us today. Dr. Jason Rosenberg. Dr. Rosenberg is a founder, is CEO of South Carolina Pain and Spine Specialist and have been in private practice for the last 20 years. Dr. Rosenberg received his medical degree from the University of South Carolina School of Medicine. He completed his neurology residency at Wake Forest University of North Carolina Baptist Hospital and interventional pain management fellowship at Wake Forest University North Carolina Baptist Hospital. Dr. Rosenberg is board certified by American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology for both neurology and pain medicine. he lecturing extensively on spinal cord stimulation and also run an active research company trialing drugs and devices for the healthcare industry. Dr. Rosenberg, we're so happy to have you today. Professor Richard North, he has been a great supporter of our journal club this year and attended every single journal club we hold this year. He doesn't need to be introduced, but I still will say a few words. Dr. North serves as a president of two charitable nonprofit organizations, the Neuromodulation Foundation and Institute for Neuromodulation. He's retired professor of neurosurgery, anesthesiology, and critical care medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where he directed the neurosurgery spine service for 16 years and co-directed the Division of Functional Neurosurgery for 10 years. He received his medical degree, postdoctoral biomedical engineering and neurosurgery training at Johns Hopkins. He holds a number of patents in the field of implanted electrical stimulation devices. The American Academy of Pain Medicine recognized Dr. North's research achievement and clinical expertise with his Founder Award in 2007, and he received Lifetime Achievement Award from the North American Neuromodulation Society in 2009, and from the American Society of Interventional Pain Physicians in 2017. And the Giant Neuromodulation Award from the Interventional Neuromodulation Society in 2019. Dr. North, without any further ado, please take away.
Thank you, Irina, for that wonderful introduction. I might add that for many years, I ran the Neurosurgery Journal Club at Hopkins. It was always one of my favorite activities. I thought it was among the most educational things we did. And so it's really nice to see the success that you're making of this NANS Journal Club.
And I appreciate your support with this journal club and being here every meeting. Yeah, I really enjoy doing this for NANS. I believe it brings a lot of value.
Thank you. Kim, may I have the next slide? So this slide simply shows my disclosures. As the saying goes, nothing to see here. Next slide, please. Today's topic is the new Cochrane review on spinal cord stimulation for low back pain, which was published on March 7th, 2023. Criticisms began appearing immediately and have continued to appear ever since. Next slide. It had been only 15 months since the last Cochrane review of SCS by O'Connell et al. In December 2021. This was on spinal cord stimulation for chronic pain in general, but it included low back pain, which is the topic at hand with the recent Traeger review. Why so soon, one might ask? Prior Cochrane reviews had in some cases been decades apart. Next slide. The first published criticism came out in the Wikistim March newsletter, which was circulated to over 1,500 prescribers 10 days after the Cochrane review came out. Next slide. Particularly noteworthy in this review was a departure from pre-published search criteria. As shown here in the yellow highlights, the original plan was to extend the search through the 10th of June, 2022. But apparently Traeger and his colleagues were waiting for publication of a paper by Hara et al. In JAMA. And when it was delayed until October, they created an exception. And this made the Hara paper the only one in the review with a, quote, treatment period of longer than 3 weeks, close quotes. This was, of course, a very select sample of papers that they chose. Next slide. So this fundamentally changed the key findings of the review. This is as shown on page 2 of the 138 pages of the Cochrane Review. Quote, at 6 months, the only available study found no benefit, close quotes, in 3 key outcome measures. These key findings were critically dependent, of course, on the last-minute protocol change that included the Harris study, the results of which surely were already known at the time the change was made. So confirmation bias is an obvious inference from this. Next slide. A month later, in the Wikistim discussion section, Derbhakula et al. Said that although, quote, society is primed to revere Cochrane publications as the peak of academic excellence, yet this review by Traeger et al. Is methodologically flawed and intentionally curated to fit a specific agenda and narrative, close quotes. This was even more explicit than my criticisms in the Wikistim newsletter. And the next slide shows her paper in which she and her colleagues had just published that month in April a summary of the flaws in the Hara paper. So in addition to trialing peculiarities, especially noteworthy was an amplitude setting, quote, effectively rendering it a placebo versus placebo trial, close quotes. I believe this will be covered in more detail later in this section, in particular by Dr. Nisevic. Next slide. The Hara paper itself was the subject of a NANS Journal Club in April of this year, at which these and other published criticisms were presented. These began with a Wikistim newsletter last year, published a few weeks after the paper came out in JAMA. JAMA had never before published a paper with primary data on spinal cord stimulation, and remarkably, neither had any of the 17 co-authors of the Hara paper. Next slide. Cochrane, of course, does its own peer review, and it publishes on its own website. And it publishes not only the scientific or academic content, if you will, it also publishes promotional materials such as this. As explained here, lead researcher Dr. Adrian Traeger is from Sydney in Australia. Next slide, please. This is from a Sydney newspaper published last October, quoting Traeger about the Hara study, which of course was from Norway, halfway around the globe. And in October, it had just been published in JAMA. Why was this reported so promptly on the other side of the world? Traeger had not yet published his review. How did the press know that he was even working on it? Next slide. Neither Traeger nor Hara had ever published anything on spinal cord stimulation before, but they are presented as authorities on the subject. One of the co-authors, Ian Harris, has published 2 books, which, as you can see, are skeptical about healthcare in general. I've read both of them, and I appreciate his viewpoint, but I think it's worth pointing these out as an indication that maybe he's not entirely objective. Next slide. We live in the era of evidence-based medicine, which proposes a hierarchy, and of course it privileges randomized controlled trials. Next slide. As evidence-based medicine has evolved, systematic reviews have been elevated above the original randomized controlled trials themselves. And in fact, next slide, their importance has been inflated, in my opinion, and is shown in this imaginative figure that I found online. Particularly given that the methodology of reviews is by no means randomized, controlled, and it's not necessarily even prospective, as witness the Traeger review, which changed its criteria at the last minute. So this is not even a pyramid any longer. And it's been asked, with good reason, I think, what the quality is of the evidence reporting the elevation of these secondary analyses over the original data. Next slide. It goes far beyond what Archie Cochrane modestly proposed back in 1971 and beyond what was proposed 25 years later in the book on the left, which came out in his memory. By the way, these are two more books I'd recommend reading. They're very interesting. Next slide. Here's something that few of us are going to undertake to read because it runs to 736 pages. This is the current Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews. It devotes 50 of its 700-some pages to considering bias and conflicts of interest. But clearly, confirmation bias is an intractable problem. Next slide. This is a psychology paper, of course, and our psychology colleagues are perhaps best equipped to speak to this issue. It's been memorably said many times over the years in many ways, as in this quote at the bottom by McKay in the 19th century. Sometimes we torture facts to support a theory of which we are fond. The annual NANS meeting is held at Caesar's Palace, and I have a growing collection of Caesar quotations from 2,000 years ago, and one of them is id quod volunt credunt. People more readily believe what they wish were true. Next slide. We see this today in popular culture. Harvey Specter is a fictional character in a TV or movie series about the law. A trial lawyer or debater can choose data selectively to support any argument. And systematic reviewers can contrive to do the same, as the data are generally available even before they begin their review, and they can pick and choose. The process, therefore, is subject to gaming and gaslighting, like anything else. So there's a saying popular today, and there must have been a version of it back in Caesar's time, to the effect that it's a beautiful country here, isn't it? So that brings me to the end of my slides, and I look forward to hearing the reviews to come.
Dr. Knizevic will talk about editorials. We have 3 of them, and he will go deeper into criticism. Before we proceed, I would like to ask if you can type, are you able to see the slides? Because someone indicated, unfortunately, I don't see the name, that they don't see slides progressing. So is everything okay for, we're gonna go to the next presentation. So I think it works for everyone else. I think so.
Okay.
Okay,
Perfect.
Dr. Knizevic.
Thank you, Dr. North. Thank you, Rina. Thank you, Alla, for nice introduction. Yeah, I have 10 minutes to go over a few editorials that were published regarding this. And Kim, if I can get next slide, please. Okay, I think, I am someone who Dr. North made nice introduction, who published, 25 systematic reviews and meta-analysis and know very well. And he made really good point that, as a level 1A evidence, now we do have systematic reviews and meta-analysis of prospective randomized trials. And being in editorial board on so many journals, I review so many of them. And it's not easy, and it's not easy to conduct. And, we have to always be careful, what is combining, and, just make sure that we don't combine and mix apples and oranges. Next slide, please. Can we go next? Okay. These are first two the editorials that were published in pain medicine and brain sciences. I'm going to bring them together because they are bringing a similar criticism. And as Dr. North mentioned previously, first we do have serious methodological issues. And the problem now that we get, and I actually come to the kind of bottom point that, because this systematic review excluded a large multi-center comparative effectiveness trials and pragmatic studies that there are many, many more of them. And because I think that only and rely actually on only few smaller single-center sham-controlled studies that exist, but the reason is because that actually FDA does not require them, and that's the reason why even neither companies nor for investigators is very expensive, but companies even don't have interest to do these type of studies. And as I mentioned earlier, definitely in this Cochrane review, systematic review, what they have done are actually mixing apples and oranges, something that we should avoid in systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Can I get next slide, please? And the first thing what they miss, that they actually combine, conventional and high frequency spinal cord stimulators. And as we can see here, there are only 3 studies. Kapural studies in 2022 was high frequency. The other 2 were conventional. However, we ran into the issue because Kumar study from 2007 primarily included the patients with a leg pain, and primary outcome was leg pain. And the whole systematic review is talking about effectiveness of spinal cord stimulators in the low back pain. Next, please. And then the problem is, goes even further, because what they got, actually, they got 7.4 times more likely to report more than 50% improvement when they included all 3 studies. However, this is, quote from the from the Cochrane review, stating that most of the heterogeneity could be explained by one trial with very large effect size, which was Kapural's trial from 2022. And they have actually decided to exclude that trial instead of Kumar trial, which was included patients with low back with a leg pain more than the back pain. They kind of cherry pick, excluded the Kapural study, and from likelihood of 7.4, they dropped to the 4.23 times. Next one, please. And as Dr. North mentioned, even though they specify and they said the third criteria included the study up to June 10th of 2022, somehow the only study that was included past that time was Khara study from JAMA, and we had the two journal clubs ago actually discussed extensively this paper that was published in October 18 of 2022. And another thing that you already mentioned, that, you know, none of the authors actually in this Cochrane review had any experience in the spinal cord stimulator for chronic low back pain. Next. And, you know, suggestions from these two editorials are, you know, reevaluation of the search methodology to ensure the comprehensive selection of the studies, 2, appropriate interpretation and synthesis of the studies based on the inclusion-exclusion criteria, allowing valid findings, diversification of authorship to include individuals with a clinical experience in neuromodulation, and conclusions of appropriate scope. Can I get the next one? And this is a more recent editorial of Dr. Peter Statz and one of our panelists, and my friend Kiran Patel, Dr. Eldabe, Chris Gilligan, and others that went really into the depth with this, with the criticism, and emphasized, you know, first population, because, you know, included the patients with what they call failed back surgery syndrome, that was renamed meanwhile as persistent spinal pain syndrome type 2. Then again, as we mentioned, process trial by Kumar from 2007, which included the patients with leg instead of back pain, which was not replicated in the PROMISE study in 2019 because included the patients with the back pain. And then, you know, 12 out of 13 studies actually that they included had patients with persistent spinal pain syndrome type 2, and only Kapural study from 2022 that used a high-frequency spinal cord stimulator included patients with persistent spinal pain syndrome type 1, which is actually non-surgical back pain, which they actually claim that they were studied in this Cochrane's review. Next one, please. And then intervention, as I already mentioned, they mixed conventional high frequency with the burst. 5 out of 8 studies use actually experimental models of stimulation that are not used in the regular clinical practice, and something that is, as mentioned before, if these authors have some experience in the clinical practice, they will realize that these frequencies that were studied were experimental. Sweet et al. In 2016 used sub-threshold high-density stimulation with a pulse width of 200 milliseconds. And already mentioned HARA studies from JAMA showed not to be different than sham stimulation, because actually the 4-spike burst intervention that they used were before even previously described as a sham. Actually, what they have done, they compare sham with a sham. Next, please. And then regarding comparators, they included a study that had placebo and also included no treatment, as well as conventional medical management, and excluded more than 10 studies published in the last 8 years that have directly compared different spinal cord stimulation modes. Some studies with a parallel arm randomized controlled trial evidence, some of which have 24 months follow-up, were not included due to very narrow eligibility criteria. Next one. Outcomes, as I mentioned before, 6 out of 8 studies compare spinal cord stimulator with a placebo, included patients with a persistent spinal pain syndrome type 2, and do not report even a low back pain intensity. Walter et al. Study from 2012 included patients with a baseline pain less than 4 out of 10, which is usual exclusion for this therapy. And primary time point was long-term follow-up, more than 12 months. However, the question is, even these studies that use that one, how ethical is to use conventional medical management or sham for extended period of time for these patients, because usually indication for spinal cord stimulation is that patients already failed this treatment. And we believe that anything beyond 3 or beyond 6 months will be completely unethical. Next. And one more, because as I said, they claiming that, primary endpoint was long-term follow-up, more than 12 months, but I think it is in these circumstances unethical to keep patients on conventional medical management that they already fail, or keep them on the sham, and maybe that's the reason why they didn't have that many studies. Regarding study design, as I said, they included randomized control trials, quasi-randomized or crossover trials, which are also especially very tricky. Hara's study was one of the crossover. That crossover was not properly even conducted. Then question regarding the blinding of the patients when conventional medical management is used as a comparison. I already mentioned included patients with the persistent spinal pain syndrome type 2 with predominant leg pain, patients with back pain, and only one study with actually non-surgical back pain, which would be persistent spinal pain syndrome 1. 13 studies only included out of more than 3,000 original reports that are in WikiStem electronic database. Thank you to Dr. North. Are actually not able to generalize to all types of spinal cord stimulators used in the clinical practice. Next. And as I said, they listed other small points, 13 studies listed, Eisenberg studies 2015 not included in any analysis. Also, authors did not use the latest Cochrane risk bias tool. They used the older version. Already mentioned that none of the authors have direct previous experience use in the spinal cord stimulator in clinical practice. They also listed Dr. Susan Moschler, which is a friend of ours, and Kieran's and my sitting together on the board of directors of the NANS, listed as author, but however, she had very limited involvement. They stated they use personal communication with the experts working in the field. However, there is no any evidence of any communication, and I already mentioned, including this paper out of the Harris paper, out of the scope and search criteria. I think that's it from me. Yeah, conclusion, several problems, serious limitations, application to the clinical practice and policies, and actually what we got, very limited evidence included in this that can do everything but not reflect any types of spinal cord stimulator that is used in the clinical practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Knežević, for your presentation and for summarizing this editorial so well. And now I would welcome our panelists to present their slides and talk more about the Cochrane review before we proceed to the general discussion. Dr. Rosenberg.
Thank you for having me. Fantastic introduction. Mine's more of risks and benefits of spinal cord stimulator. So we talked about the bias in the studies, but where are these risks or where are these adverse events coming from? One study had 9 participants, 18% experienced adverse events to include infection, nerve damage, bladder problems, and lead migration. Next, please. The only placebo-controlled study over the 12 months found 4 participants, or 8%, required repeat surgery. In the 5 other studies, 4.1% at 8 weeks to 30.9% at 24 months. Again, 30% of patients at 24 months. It's not possible to estimate how common compared to placebo, as limited information was available. So these numbers, 30% of serious adverse events at 24 months, not broken down. Spinal cord stimulator can certainly run the gamut from, we've seen lots of studies, Dr. North's more the expert in this regard, but lots of studies with lots of complications of spinal cord stimulators. Everything's reported. That goes back to training at NANS, that goes back to advanced training with fellowship-trained physicians, but 30% is a pretty high number of serious adverse events. I don't really have too much further to break these down because that could be a whole topic in itself. Next, please.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. You will have more opportunities to discuss once we open for the audience questions. Dr. Patel, I would welcome you to present your slides.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the Education Committee, Dr. El-Sayed, for having me here, and for you, Armina, and such wonderful presentations already given by Dr. North and Dr. Nevik and Dr. Rosenberg. You know, a lot of what we're saying is quite redundant. And, you know, I'm a pain medicine fellowship director and trained physicians in neuromodulation. And I say that there are certain landmarks in spinal cord stimulation that are important for all physicians in the School of Neuromodulation to know. But I think there are also other impactful bodies of literature that we need to understand. And I think, you know, this Traeger Cochrane review, the HERA article, which we've discussed and was discussed on a previous NANS education webinar, I think is equally important to really understand and digest its impact on the field so that we can truly be advocates for neuromodulation. That being said, you know, it's actually very nice to see so many members of our field come together on independent editorials to you know, defend this therapy and to point out the flaws of the Cochrane study by Traeger, and then also the HERA study. Next slide. So at the risk of being redundant, we're going to go over kind of the population criteria that was included in the study. That they were looking at adult participants greater than 18 years of either gender, chronic lower back pain of greater than 12 weeks duration, and pain with or without leg pain. And what was included in this was failed back surgical syndrome, which is kind of an antiquated term and possibly better represented by PSPS type 2, which we know is characterized by a fluctuating sciatic description of pain. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the populations evaluated, you know, we know that one of the challenges of previous early randomized controlled trials of paresthesia-based spinal cord stimulation was the challenge of obtaining paresthesias in the lower back. And the authors of the Cochrane review go as far as to say that the large effect on leg pain observed in the PROCESS trial by Kumar was not replicated in the PROMISE trial. Now, this is important to understand. These are some of those, you know, landmark trials that came very early on, looking at tonic stimulation. And if we look at the PROMISE trial, we see that leg pain was less than back pain, and that the average leg pain score of 5.3 and the average back pain 7.5. And if we compare this to the population in the PROCESS trial, this is very different. These are patients who have significantly more leg pain than back pain, with the average leg pain being 7.5 and their average back pain score being 5. Now, this is just one of the specific examples of how there is significant heterogeneity in the populations included in the Cochrane review. You know, we're talking about different body parts. What else is important to note is that 12 of the 13 studies included evaluated patients with PSPS type 2. And we, you know, again, with that more of a predominance of leg pain and varying amounts of sciatic pain, not with an emphasis of lower back pain. And of the 3 randomized controlled trials that were evaluated, there were 3 heterogeneous populations, you know, PSPS type 2 with predominant leg pain, and then PSPS type 2 with predominant back pain, and then PSPS type 1 as represented by the Caporal study. Next slide, please. You know, looking at the modes of stimulation that were evaluated, and Dr. Nevik already spoke to this, you know, 5 of the 8 eligible studies were looking at experimental modes of stimulation. And what's important is that our authors here looked at, you know, they wanted placebo-controlled studies. And so these SCS modes were tested more to explore the impact of increasing parameters of the stimulation, frequency, and to test a novel type of burst. All of these experimental modes, it's really important to know that their intensities were lower than what is used in clinical practice to avoid those patients experiencing paresthesias, therefore to maintain their blinding. And none of these SCS modalities that were used in these studies are those that are accepted in routine clinical practice. So an overriding review, which is establishing standards of care with regard to clinical practice, it's important to understand what's really consistent in these studies. And specifically in the Harris study, the authors actually intended to look at a 5-spike burst with passive recharge, but what they ended up using, and it's not quite clear, why, was a 4-spike burst. And that, Dr. Eldave had already, 2 years prior to this publication, had already established that this was equivalent to the effect of sham. So very significant to note that. The findings of a review that include mostly experimental modes of stimulation really are not generalizable to other stimulation modes and don't reflect what's going on as the clinical standard of practice. Both the process and promise studies evaluated tonic stimulation, and then Caporal et al. Looked at the use of high frequency. Next slide. In terms of outcomes, the main outcomes that were considered in the Cochrane review by Traeger et al. were mean low back pain intensity, function, health-related quality of life, global assessment of efficacy, adverse events, and serious adverse events. And as stated earlier, it's important to know that 6 out of these 8 studies, we're looking at the comparison of SCS versus placebo at intermediate, and then one at actually median follow-up, had participants with PSPS type 2 or leg and back pain that did not specifically actually report results for lower back pain or intensity. So if our main outcomes are mean low back pain intensity, and we're including studies that don't report that, that's problematic. And in fact, what's really important to remember is that potentially the 2 studies that were included with PSPS type 2 were not representative of the broader chronic back pain population. Something of note, it was interesting to say they looked at 12-month outcomes, and the author's direct verbiage was, "We chose this primary time point because SCS systems can degrade over time and require replacement." The use of the word degrade implies many things. And for people who are reading this, who may not be experts in neuromodulation, that leaves a lot of question marks. What is meant by degrade? And I think it's safe to say that the systems do not degrade over time, the system itself, and they do not certainly always require a 12-month replacement. Next slide, please. So in terms of the trial inclusion and exclusion criteria, we were looking at randomized controlled trials or quasi-randomized controlled trials with crossover trials. And a lot of the most recent randomized controlled trials were excluded. As discussed by Dr. Nevik earlier, like many of our crossover trials have been, very flawed. For example, the HERA article, which we've spoken about in previous NANS Education Committee webinars. And, as Dr. North pointed out, many of the evidence, there's so much evidence that has been put forth about spinal cord stimulation and the implications of looking at just 13 studies that were included. They don't reflect the whole body of evidence in spinal cord stimulation. And so much of what was included, though, was looking at the effect of SCS versus placebo, including experimental white waveforms, the type of parameters that we would not use in the standard of care or any type of clinical practice. Next slide. So what's interesting is those of you who are students of neuromodulation, that, the standard of care has kind of evolved with neuromodulation. We've looked at, we've looked at evidence initially from spinal cord stimulation compared to medical management. And we've looked at spinal cord stimulation plus medical management versus medical management alone. And these studies in the Cochrane review were actually downgraded due to bias, because there's no way to blind, whether somebody has spinal cord stimulation and medical management versus medical management alone. And this is problematic because, sham controlled studies by independent physicians, we struggled to have these in the space because they're expensive to perform, and it's difficult to actually recruit patients and maintain patients for these studies. On the other side of it, our industry partners are kind of disincentivized because the U.S. Food and Drug Administration does not actually require sham controlled for regulatory approvals whenever there is a predicate device. Next slide. So again, as stated, the authors included trials with placebo, no treatment, or medical management. This excluded more than 10 clinical trials published in the last 8 years that have directly compared SCS to different stimulation modes. What also was not included is evidence comparing SCS against revision surgery. That was not included anywhere in this review. What's interesting is, as stated before, past trials have compared SCS to what is the standard of care. So Process looked at SCS plus medical management versus medical management alone. Promise was looking at SCS to medical management in order to evaluate the efficacy of SCS for a new indication, which was predominantly back pain and with PSPS type 2. And then, Caporal looked at high frequency spinal cord stimulation compared to medical management, looking at the population of PSPS type 1. And so it's reasonable to assume, like other therapies, that as the field has advanced, the trials of new stimulation paradigms change and evolve in terms of what is the standard of care. Many of parallel arm randomized controlled evidence, some of up to 24-month follow-up, was not included because of this narrow eligibility criteria of trials which had placebo, no treatment, or medical management comparators. Next slide, please. Selection bias. My colleagues here have described this at significantly, and it's really important, though, that the database search listed in the actual review states June 10th, 2022. However, the HERA article was published October 18th of 2022. This is really important. And as discussed in a previous webinar, and many editorials, this study kind of did not replicate clinical practice. Patients did not need to report at least 50% pain relief. Tonic stimulation was actually used during the trial, and then the actual experimental evaluative mode was burst stimulation. And then a 4-spike burst pattern was used, again, even when the investigators themselves stated that their intent was to use a 5-spike passive recharge burst. Similarly, the I2 analysis that eliminated the Caporal study, saying that, there was heterogeneity and that there was an excessive large effect. It's not really appropriate to use this when we are looking at only 3 studies. This is something that's more appropriate when you're looking at several studies. And in fact, if we flip this and think that if the Kumar study had been eliminated from the beginning as a study of leg pain, only the Riegard and the Caporal study would have been included in the sub-analysis. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Dr. Patel, for such a nice presentation. I would like to open the floor to our panelists, to our audience, and encourage attendees to submit their questions. And while we are waiting for the questions, let me come back to Dr. North and ask I think one of the, maybe general, but one of the very important question to Dr. North and the rest of the panelists, Dr. Rosenberg and Dr. Patel. So this is our third journal club, which is dedicated to discussing and analyzing controversial papers, which basically are attacking spinal cord stimulation, and they somehow happen all together this year. So my question now to all of you: where are we going from here? So this webinar probably important because this is the third final covering same issue of criticizing spinal cord stimulation modality is a way of pain treatment. So where are we going from here? Dr. North? Dr. North?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Good. Yes. I had a comment on the subject at hand before we broaden this to Journal Club more generally. And that's following up on a point that Dr. Patel made. And she made it well, but I'd like to put it in different terms. Traditional paresthesia-based spinal cord stimulation, in fact, was until recently the only form of SCS available, and it was used in the earliest RCTs of spinal cord stimulation. So our 2005 study comparing it with repeated surgery on the lumbosacral spine, and Kumar's study in 2005 comparing it with conservative medical management. Both of them showed a highly significant advantage for SCS. Both were accepted as high quality evidence at the time. But now we have paresthesia-free spinal cord stimulation. And because there are studies using it, and they are in a higher category of evidence, the older studies that could not possibly be blinded are being pretty much ignored. And I think that's rather silly. They should be considered in a category by themselves because they are fundamentally different. In general, there are some treatments which preclude blinding. You can't blind patients as to whether they've had surgery in many forms. And yet, without question, we do heart transplants and kidney transplants and any number of other procedures. There are treatments for which randomization is not even feasible, and their efficacy simply has to be judged by different methods. They can't follow the strict criteria that are in fashion. But insisting on those criteria and insisting on blinded randomized trials is in that respect simply lazy. So I think that represents a challenge for us as to how we properly investigate treatments like that can't be blinded and put them in their proper place in the continuum of available and accepted treatments.
Thank you, Dr. North, for available comments. Dr. Patel, do you want to add something to what Dr. North just said?
Yes, I think, and there's some interesting questions in the chat, asking about, what can we do? How can we explain this therapy to other specialties who say that, spinal cord stimulation is an overpriced gizmo that doesn't work, right? And I think more than ever, physicians need to take it upon themselves to be advocates for the therapy on an individual level and understand the information that's being put in kind of the mainstream medical literature, and to be advocates, to be vociferous about the actual flaws of it. Much of it discussed in this series within the education committee webinar series. And, I think so on an individual level, we need to be advocates for the therapy by understanding the pieces and the bodies of knowledge that have been put out there, these studies and the meta-analyses that have been put out there, and being able to explain what the flaws are in a very cogent way. And I hope that those people who watch these webinars who were not able to attend will gain that from this, and I think they will. On a larger level, on a societal level, we realize that we need to do some work as well about trying to organize, those of us who are dedicated to these therapies and have great clinical practices in terms of how to implement them and how to select patients. And we need to kind of work, we need to strive for more and for better, and to try to develop some studies outside of industry that really show that these therapies can be efficacious. And these studies need to be well designed. One of the challenges, as you all know, we've had in the field is that to have non-industry sponsored spinal cord stimulation studies, that's been challenging to find sources of support for that, financial support. And I think that's something on the societal level that we need to. And on the third level, I think we need to work with our industry partners to understand that we see countless lives that have been impacted that in a positive way by these therapies. And we need to work with our industry partners to find a way to kind of, create studies that are beyond reproach. And I think that's an ideal goal. And I think each level of this will bring us closer as a society and as a field to really protecting this therapy that we genuinely feel can help patients.
Thank you, Dr. Patel. I see Dr. Rosenberg want to say and comment. Dr. Rosenberg, welcome.
Thank you. So there's a question there about how do you approach your primary care physicians who bring up the Cochrane review study and have issues. I think that's important. I've been in practice for going on 20 years. I'm a big believer in anecdotal evidence when it comes to patients and patient care. And I won't say anecdotal evidence, but you sent me Mrs. Smith 3 years ago. Mrs. Smith has been off all opioids. Mrs. Smith is out walking on the beach with her grandchildren. Mrs. Smith has a spinal cord stimulator. And I think that's an easy thing to talk about with the primary care physicians or the people that would possibly read the Cochrane review and bring it up in private practice. Again, a much different mindset than Journal Club for published research for academic world versus private practice. But in private practice, that's how we do it. When you meet a new doctor and you have a great outcome with one of their patients, you send them a personalized letter or a phone call or text and say, look at how good this patient's doing. And it's one patient at a time, more so than this Cochrane review. But I thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Real clinical outcomes in the end of the day, the most important criteria. We have a couple of more, we have a lot of questions. The next question, thank you for the comprehensive presentation. Given the overwhelming amount of flaws, why do you think this article was approved for publishing? Very interesting question. So who would like to start? So why do you think it was published? Dr. North?
Well, Cochrane self-publishes. It's an entity unto itself, and it does not conduct peer review in the same way as our journals do. I don't know about the rest of you, but we can ask if anybody else has ever been asked by Cochrane to review one of their fine products. I never have. And I mean, they are an enterprise like so many others, and taking a broad and charitable review of this. I'm fond of quoting Bill Brodie, who was president of Johns Hopkins University. He was himself a radiologist and an entrepreneur, and he liked to point out that there is a conflict of interest as soon as any of us, in particular a physician or scientist, has an idea that they would like to develop and explore further. Naturally, they are going to look for things that support that idea. But surely we shouldn't say that's wrong. And so the Cochrane enterprise, particularly as it was first inspired by Archie Cochrane, is very worthwhile. And I think it's positive overall, but there are exceptions such as this particular review. And I think it can be done well, and it can be done not so well. So it's good that we are exercising our free speech rights and criticizing it as we are.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. North. A lot of things are clear. They are getting clear now. Dr. Patel, I think you also want to comment on that question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, you know, and I have to say, and at the risk of being public enemy number one, you know, there is a trend in mainstream medical publications nowadays to really want to publish negative findings, to negative studies. And one could clearly see, based on all of the cogent arguments that were presented tonight, that, you know, how you delineate the lines of a review, of a systematic review, because that, you know, is our topic tonight, can definitely paint that picture. And I think, you know, we need to be cognizant of that. And we need to be cognizant of other factors, other people who are having their hands in studies. You know, the influence of big insurance companies that are, you know, teaming up with researchers to develop bodies of work, you know, as discussed, you know, with the Harris study. And so the impact of these things. So I think we really need to be, more than ever, as physicians, advocates for our patients by being critical of the literature and understanding how those lines are drawn and what the implications are as to how those lines are drawn.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Patel. It's a great point. I think we need to realize that we really need to understand how the studies are published and made it, as you and Dr. North just mentioned and discussed, and at the same time see how what we should apply to real clinical practice and what we need to be conscious about. So we have a few other questions. The next question: currently, there are several paresthesia-free devices like DTM 10 kilohertz in the market. Why not pushing for the strong RST for low back pain? So is this question clear to everyone who would like to start?
So I think this question is getting at the heart that, you know, if it's paresthesia free, that is, you know, renders itself to be amenable to potentially sham controlled. I think historically, you know, as touched on by many of our speakers tonight, the problems we face in spinal cord stimulation when we look at sham versus paresthesia free is that there's two really major issues in my mind. Is one, being able to recruit and maintain patients for these studies, and two, the ethical concepts of maintaining somebody with an implantable device and, you know, delivering a sham therapy. So I think there's the two aspects there, I think, that have barred many of these from coming forward. Now, certainly for our industry partners, as stated before, you know, as soon as there is a device in the market, there's a predicate device, you don't need to establish the efficacy of sham versus the therapy. And so that has shaped much of the literature that we have seen thus far.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Rosenberg, Dr. North, do you want to comment on this question?
Yeah, I think who's going to pay for it? So that's always comes down to research. I have a clinical research company for the past 20 years, and who's going to invest the money to compare one versus the other I would love to see lots of studies like that, but industry is not going to pay for it, and I don't think it's going to be privately funded, but that's the cynic in me.
The two forms of SCS that are mentioned in the question are proprietary. There are others, of course. Burst isn't mentioned, and there are different versions of that. It would be cumbersome indeed to try to organize, let alone fund, such a study. If we go back to the HARA study just for a moment, at the end of it all, you might recall the authors promised to let the patients use their stimulators in open-labeled fashion after the study was over, and to report back to us how it worked out. So for the particular system that they were using Boston Scientific, which has what they call a FAST algorithm. It begins with paresthesia-based stimulation to optimize the selection of contacts, and then can go forward to use either paresthesia-based or paresthesia-free stimulation. The HARA authors did report in a follow-up letter to the editor of JAMA what happened when they went to the open label phase of the study, but the reporting was just so incomplete that they seemed to say nothing more than, well, we handed the patients a programmer that allowed them free access to different parameters, and it didn't seem to make any difference. There was no hint that they actually let them sit down with a company rep who capable of leading them through the adjustment process, which of course is standard practice, indeed standard of care. Maybe they can get away with that in Norway, but that I don't think that would happen here. In any event, it's a shame when there is an opportunity presented by a study like this, which in some ways is high quality, and then the authors can get away with such disappointing long-term follow-up and reporting.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. North. We have a lot of questions. The next one, for the back pain and predominant axial pain, frequency 10 has worked great in my practice. I couldn't agree more with Dr. North on his words about clinical trials that cannot have the same standard as transplant. We certainly need to protect access to these devices. And the rest of the questions from Daria, Dr. Daria Grisels. So the next one, I believe, connected. Dr. North, how would be sham be? How would be the shame for a transplant study?
The point I was trying to make was that sham for certain treatments, like a transplant, really is not possible from the ethical standpoint. It just wouldn't be acceptable to do a sham operation for a big procedure like that. Back in the 50s, there was a sham study of internal mammary ligation for angina, but that's a relatively minor procedure. And those were different times. I don't think it would be feasible to do such a study nowadays. It would be at best difficult to get it past institutional review board.
Makes sense. And there is one more question from Daria Grisels. Do you think that a spinal cord stimulation study, they need to be crossover so that everybody get the therapy? So that all SAS studies need to be crossover? I believe this is the question for everyone, for Dr. North, Dr. Rosenberg, and Dr. Patel. Dr. North?
I think the option of crossover should be available in any or all of these randomized studies for simple ethical reasons. Yeah, it's hard to imagine going to an IRB and proposing a study of spinal cord stimulation in which half of the patients would never get it, even if they wanted it.
Dr. Patel?
So we've seen some interesting trends. As the field of neuromodulation and pain medicine has evolved, we see, the concept of PGIC, patient global impression of change, has been embraced very much so. And I think the concept of crossover, and then the profound option we've seen in some very recent randomized controlled studies, is this idea that patients can decide to cross over and then to cross back. And that really shows what they are choosing for their therapy. And I think that makes a strong statement in terms of what patients, choices. I think that's something that we're going to continue to see evolve. And I'd like to see evolve. I think that crossover and then, deciding to choose which therapy they ultimately like, regardless of the arms, how you design the study, whether it's two waveforms, whether it's a waveform and a sham, I think is pretty powerful. And I'd like to see us as a field explore that more in the years to come with greater studies.
Thank you, Dr. Patel. Dr. Rosenberg, what do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So I generally don't design the studies. I just execute other people's studies. Crossover makes all the sense to me. Just everybody gets a chance to try it. Double blind, absolutely. I love that stuff. Sham trials, hard with spinal cord stimulator for implant trials, too short a time frame. So I'm not sure how we're going to get to a sham spinal cord stimulator implant. I don't know if that's feasible, just to go back to other questions. But sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we conclude our webinar, I would like to actually come back to my question, which I started with. Dr. Knizevic, do you have any specific question? I still want to come back to this general question, where we're going from here, because this is the third of final webinar for this year, going over and discussing all this papers.
Yeah. You know, first to continue, I think crossover is great. Only problem is because, you know, we need enough time because, you know, crossover design, you need washout period. The question is how long is going to be the effect of the spinal cord stimulator and how long we should keep that washout period before we switch to another treatment option. You know, as Dr. Patel mentioned earlier, you know, the great thing is, you know, with these paresthesia-free devices that we can use sham stimulation. And, you know, this is kind of, we are getting back to, you know, Irina, your question and, you know, something that we discussed when the first paper got published in JAMA and then JAMA Neurology and this one. And I'm afraid that this is not the end because, you know, we could do as many as possible journal clubs, editorials and stuff, and the question is, you know, how many readers really read all these editorials and how many people are going to fix just to the abstracts of the Cochrane review or any JAMA article. But that is, you know, JAMA very well known on publishing these negative studies. But I think until we find some way to get help, I'm sure from the industry, because these studies are very expensive. There is really no way that, you know, any single site or, you know, private practice or university can sponsor these type of trials. We definitely need the support from industry. And you know, not to be sponsored, but kind of support some central multi-center study that is going to be randomized control trial. I'm afraid that we're going to keep getting this very, you know, not proper study that, you know, don't have enough sample size, that are messing with the inclusion-exclusion criteria and showing no effect. And, you know, I think we are doing pretty good job. We are trying, and we as a NANS, we're doing good job in educating colleagues, educating community, patients, etc. But I'm afraid that this is not the end, that the next year we'll have another negative study coming up, because it's and, you know, regardless how bad it is, you know, I'm kind of afraid until we get some very strong randomized control trials and figure out the way how we're going to do it, that this whole, you know, game and fight is not going to stop.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Dr. Knizevic. From one side, if it's solely industry-funded study, so it gets attacked in that way, that it's solely industry-funded. But at the same time, without good multicentral studies, we're not able to provide evidence-based data to convince stakeholders, policymakers that it's a great kind of medical, minimally invasive intervention, which can be in many cases superior to conventional medical treatment. So there is a trend of academia and industry collaboration. This is my thought. I'm not aware. Dr. Nov might comment on that. Because he has been an excellent academic physician and being involved in a lot of innovation and patents and worked very close with industry as well. So I think my thought on that close, transparent, but efficient collaboration between academia and industry might change something. Because at the same time, it gets credibility of transparency of academia. At the same from another side, everyone benefit, because industry is able to oversee and come with the ideas and actually influence in a good way the way it's happening. So this is my thought, and I am a junior in this field. I'm so honored to lead to moderate this journal clubs this year on that level. So, but this is how I see a person who is entering the field. This is how I see it's going. And from another side, in European physicians say it's art. I mean, in the US, it's more evidence-based. But in Europe, we say it's art of medicine. And I want to, what Dr. Rosenberg mentioned and discuss really well. We need to, maybe they change the way medicine is seen, that not everything can be proved. Not everything can be demonstrated on a scientific level. Sometimes we're not able to prove something scientifically, but it doesn't mean it doesn't work. So if it works among clinicians and it really helps and change life of people, I think this has to have its voice like it's used to be many years ago. So art of medicine shouldn't go away. This is how I see this. So, Dr. North, what do you think?
Well, thanks for asking. As regards industry sponsorship, the need for it, of course, arises because spinal cord stimulation devices are so expensive. So I can see two ways to deal with it. One is to use less expensive technology. So there are systems now that are intended only for temporary use over a period of 60 to 90 days. And so that should make it a lot cheaper to do such studies. The prices I've heard for that particular technology strike me as remarkably high, but manufacturers of devices which are permanently implanted sell their trial leads at very favorable prices. And so if one could do a study in the short term, then that would be one approach to keeping the cost down. Another, of course, is technology that does not involve expensive implanted batteries, recharge systems, and so on and so forth. And that takes us back to when I first got into the field, and the only game in town was a radio frequency coupled externally powered system with an implanted receiver. And I used those preferentially until they were no longer available. That's until about 2006, when the manufacturers just stopped making them. They claimed that some critical components were no longer available. I wondered about that a little bit, but in more recent history, there have been externally powered devices that take advantage of miniaturization and that will fit in their entirety through a needle. And those the price on those did not come down as much as it might have. But I think that's another potential path to making studies feasible without the need for industry sponsorship, as is necessary with the more expensive and more profitable technology. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Dr. Narp. We have a few minutes left, but I still want Dr. Patel and Dr. Rosenberg comment on this, because Dr. Knežević really started a very important discussion for another webinar, I think. So, Dr. Patel, please.
So at the risk of sounding very overly optimistic, I think the art of medicine in the United States is still very much alive. And I say that from a very practical standpoint, in the sense that big data is watching, right? So each one of us, our physicians or neuromodulators, people are looking at our outcomes. Insurance companies are keeping tabs on how many devices are going in and how many devices are coming out. And so I very much say that the art of medicine is alive, because everything starts with each individual physician. And as Dr. Rosenberg mentioned, each individual patient. So right therapy, right patient, right therapy, really important in terms of protecting our outcomes. And I think each physician, needs to really take this on. And I think that has to be part of our ethos as a society, as a medical society, that we're really, encouraging that kind of standard of care and that self-monitoring, because others are starting to look at the big data that is being gathered on patients. And I think with that, we need to definitely, think about our patient selection critically as it relates to patient outcomes. I completely agree with Dr. North in terms of, decreasing the cost of the therapy itself will inevitably lead to less scrutiny. I think this is beneficial for many reasons, not just to, obfuscate the scrutiny, but I think to improve outcomes for our patients and to improve overall access to care for patients. So I hope that kind of answers what you're looking for.
Oh, any answer is so available and important. Thank you, Dr. Patel. Yeah. Patients come first. Dr. Rosenberg.
Yeah, the only decreasing costs I see are the decreasing or declining physician reimbursements through Medicare. That's the only thing that's coming down with cost. Everything else is going up. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Knežević, I want you to say last remarks and
Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Dr. North, for being support for all these our journal clubs. I think it's great collaboration between educational and research committee. I want to thank all panelists. I want to thank all of you who attended this webinar and for all great questions. And hoping to have, like Karen mentioned, more journal clubs and more papers with more optimistic results in the future. Thank you so much. And
thank you, everyone. So looking forward to see you at our NANS annual conference in January, and most of you seeing in person.
Yep, if not before, see you in January in Las Vegas.
Yeah, in Las Vegas, yeah.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.